friends, it's Dan. Welcome back. Welcome to another plastic miniature review, this time for the Blood and Plunder Militia, produced by Firelock Games. And as with all sponsored videos, I want you to know right away that this is sponsored because Firelock sent this to me to review for you. So huge thanks to Firelock for their ongoing support of the channel here, and actually with this set, they sent alongside it their 7th plastic set in their current catalog, and once we review that one, we'll have done everything that they currently make in multi-part plastic, which will be a really cool feeling. They also sent me their Blood and Plunder rulebook, which we'll be doing a flip through for, and their Port Royal rulebook, which is a skirmish level version of this game system, which is more warband style. I've said in all of these Blood and Plunder reviews, I'll say it here again, that I don't talk about value. I used to say I don't talk about price, but it seems I'm talking about price constantly these days, so I'll instead carefully say that I don't assign value to sets. I think my job is to present information, and then you can make a determination about value based on how many miniatures you're going to need for a game system or a project, what your budget is. All those things influence, the subjective concept of value. In this case, these are slightly more expensive per model than what you would get from a company like, say, Victrix or North Star, or even War Games Atlantic, but cheaper than you might get from, say, Games Workshop, or for game systems like Star Wars Legion, Infinity. Those are metal models, so it's not a direct comparison, but that's more the point I'm making here, is that because this is a skirmish level game, you're already going to expect to be paying a slightly higher per model price because you're just not going to need that many miniatures compared to what you might need for a mass battles game. The other consideration too is that kind of anytime you have miniatures that are game or rule set specific, there's usually a slight premium on those compared to a rule set agnostic set of miniatures. So all that's just something to keep in mind. The layout of the Blood and Plunder boxes we've seen follows a kind of similar formula where you have some painted miniatures in a maybe action scene on the front of the box. Then you have some more blown up versions of the same miniatures on the back of the box. I've said before that my preference, if you're going to have painted miniatures, is to have them painted to a very high standard, like almost an absurdly high standard. However, I do want to share some thoughts from some commenters on the last video that haven't necessarily changed my mind, but I think that it's a solid counterpoint, which is that when you have miniatures that are more simply painted, it presents something that is more attainable. Like that's something that I could do versus sort of the old school heavy metal style of let me put something on the box that is more, say, aspirational, that this is like the best that they could possibly look, versus, again, having miniatures on the box that don't look intimidating. It looks like something that I could actually pull off. So I appreciate that perspective too. Again, I would submit that I think I would still prefer to have them look as good as they possibly could on the box, just for the purpose of selling merchandise. There is a QR code here on the back. We've seen in some sets that they have assembly instructions that come with them, like printed out assembly instructions. So nice to have a QR code there too. I'm old school. I always prefer some kind of like physical document versus QR codes, but I appreciate that is the way of things in the world that we currently live in. So as with all of my reviews, I've already isolated the sprues from inside of the box. So let me put these here for you. What you're also going to get, I didn't mention that there are 12 miniatures inside of this box, and what you're going to get alongside 2 sprues, 6 miniatures per sprue, are a little bag full of their what I believe are 20mm round bases, and you can see that they're textured to look like the deck of a ship, perhaps, or like a planking along a boardwalk or something like that, or a dock in the back. If you wanted, you could just flip them over and use them like this, and then, base them however you would normally. So if you're new here, welcome. What we're going to do is isolate one of these sprues, because I mentioned they are identical. We're going to review all the bits in detail, give you breakdowns on the numbers. I'm going to assemble these figures, and I like to do kit bashing at that stage, and I think I'm going to focus in on kit bashing these with the soldiers and the sailors that we've reviewed previously for the Firelock range, the Blood and Plunder range. But once that's done, once we have some miniatures assembled, I want to do some scale comparisons with some other manufacturers, and then I'll give you my final thoughts. That's the direction we're headed. Let me isolate one of these sprues for you here, and then we'll give you the old shot of the front and the back here. So the layout is quite similar actually to the soldiers set, which makes sense because conceptually these I think are meant to represent kind of something in between what we saw with the soldiers, which is a very uniform look, both literally and figuratively, I suppose, and then the sailors, which have much more motley appearance to them. So these are kind of something in between, where the bodies, if we kind of hone in here, remind me a little bit of the sailors. I think you could easily make some sailors out of these guys. But again, kind of a blending between the soldiers and the sailors, just in terms of styling, which makes sense. More so that these guys are just wearing coats, whereas I don't think any of the sailors did. Some of them have vests, but by and large they were just in shirts and trousers. And then a couple of detached legs here. We saw this kind of in a more extreme way with the Native American set that we reviewed, where I think a lot of them had detached legs and even detached loincloths. And the main advantage to doing something like this is that it allows for more movement on a figure, because again, you can imagine with a plastic injection mold that that's the width that you have to play with. So if you have a leg that you're trying to have extend out beyond that, you have to have it as a detached piece. So we see that here with this, what I believe is going to be a kneeling figure, and then these two here that are in running poses. But beyond that, they look reasonably straightforward to put together. You just have to match up the correct leg. I should mention here too, again, there are assembly instructions that you can scan. I'm going to try my best to do it without them, just to see how I can get along. But you can see they have a numbering system that we've seen across almost all of their plastic sets, I think, where you have like body D6 can be coupled up with arm D3, or there's probably another D arm in here somewhere. We'll get to that in a second. And then the same thing up here at the top. You can see there are D heads, which I have found from experience are the ones that they intend to go with these bodies. So there's more modularity there than that might suggest. It just means if you stick to that numbering system, you're going to be safe. The only issue I've ever found is with the neck attachments. If you're mixing and matching the heads, that sometimes you can create some like leaning poses if you don't shave off some of the neck, if you're trying to blend heads. But there are some options there. We'll get there. I'm kind of jumping around. But I think the bodies look good. I think that's really nice detail. Good mix of belts, buttons. There's no pouches sculpted directly onto them, but you can see there's some down here that can be added separately to some of these belt loops. But they look good. Let's talk heads. So we started talking about heads, but you can see up here at the top there's a whole number of them. There's 14 heads in total. Let me see how far I can zoom in for you. So you can see a good mix of expressions on these guys. And if you're not familiar with any of my Blood and Plunder reviews, this might seem unusual to you, but you can see they have this two-part head attachment system. So they have lots of hats scattered around the sprue, then match up with these heads. So once again, I think that's going to be the one area where you're going to need the instructions, because in my experience, you can't really freely mix and match these hats onto these heads. There is, once again, some modularity to it. But at a glance, there's no way for me to know if hat G5 is supposed to go on head G, for example, or if it's supposed to go on head 5, like the 5 series heads. I'm not sure without looking at the instructions. And I'm curious to see, just from dry fitting, how much mixing and matching I can do. Because I found with some sets there was quite a bit, and with some other ones there was less. But what's here I think is very nice as a starting point. And then I mentioned there are all these hats, so 14 heads, and you can see the hats fall into a couple of different categories. Started looking at these brimmed hats, a couple of tricorn hats here, another brimmed one, and there are some more options down here, which is cool to represent, again, militia. You have some farmers in here, you've got some fancier looking hats for maybe like some merchants or something like that. This one's kind of like beaten up looking. But if I didn't specify, there are 14 heads, and there are also 14 hats to accompany them, which does, of course, suggest that certain hats are meant to go on certain heads. And then from there, let's talk about arms. So you can see here, kind of the middle of the sprue is dominated by these arm options. This mirrors what we saw with the soldiers set specifically, in that there are mostly muskets. There's no like close combat weapons on here like we saw with the sailors. And there's two types of muskets. So there's these flintlock designs, And then these matchlock designs. Curiously, not enough to arm everybody the same way. There are enough flintlocks for everybody to get a flintlock if you would like, but if you wanted the earlier matchlock style, there are only 4 of those. And once again, pay attention to the fact that only certain bodies are meant to accommodate them. Again, if you're clever enough with your kit bashing, you can mix and match beyond what's just suggested. That's one of the beauties of plastic, of course. So it's very easy to do that, but you can see certain arms, like E5 is meant to go on body E, just from experience. Kind of scattered around, we looked at some of these pouches before. There's some pouches down here. There are some tomahawks, that's what I would call them. You could say it's a hatchet, but I think if these are meant to be like Americans, then they'd probably be tomahawks. There's 6 daggers, which could actually be bayonets now that I'm thinking about it. Those might be plug bayonets. So yeah, maybe those are plug bayonets. And then there are 9 scabbards. You can see slightly different stylings to them. And there you have it. So quite a robust sprue. Again, reminds me maybe more of the soldiers than of the crew, just in terms of the equipment that come with it. But in terms of styling, it is, I think, decidedly something in between. So let me cut now. I want to assemble these figures. I want to do some kit bashing with both the soldiers and with the sailors and see what kind of figures I can come up with here. So I'll see you in a second. Okay, I've got a couple of build miniatures here that I wanted to show to you guys. So the first 2 are just straight out of the box, no conversion work whatsoever. And I think they look cool. This loading pose was a surprise to me. I think he's pretty neat. That's not something that we've seen in any of the other plastic sets that we've reviewed so far. Here's a nice shooting pose. Really beautiful models all assembled. Fun. Make like a frontiersman kind of guy. Now I did do some conversion work here for you, as I like to do, but I do want to make the caveat here that it requires a little bit more cutting than you might be used to from, say, like a North Star set. And that's really because these miniatures are, to me, kind of, if you'll like indulge me for a second, imagine a Venn diagram of multi-part, multi-option, and multi-pose figures, right? That these, I think, kind of fall into the circle between multi-part and multi-option. In that, what I'm trying to say is that they're not really multi-pose. They're meant to go together a certain way, and that mostly has to do with the arm attachment points. Like you can see, like this one here is a good example, where see how it cuts in to conform to these sleeves. It makes for a very solid join on the miniatures when you put them together. Nice seamless connection points there, and they're beautifully detailed as a result as well, but it does make it a little bit trickier for mixing and matching between sets, as I am such a fan of doing without a little bit of cutting work. So I'm making all of those notes there just to explain what I've done, so you can see that's like exactly what I've done here is cut the sleeves off at the shoulders there to make them flush to then accommodate these arms. So this is, if I wasn't clear, a body from the Militia set, arms and a head, and then that little accessory are all from the Sailor's box. So I think that looks pretty neat. Here's the same thing done with the soldiers sets. Of the bodies of Militia, the accessory, the arms, and the head are all from the Soldier's box, which also looks cool. Again, this box kind of it being in between the Sailors and the Soldiers aesthetically means that it bridges a nice gap between those 2 sets, and it blends very nicely with both. And then this is the opposite. This is a Sailor's body, arms, and a head from this set. This Militia box actually has a couple of musket arms. I think that the Sailor's box particularly benefit from. There's like a couple of shooting arms. As I said, the only thing to be aware of is you just have to be a little bit more creative in terms of the assembly. Like when you're putting it together, you might have to do a little bit of cutting, or you have to be a little bit more careful about, which arms do you select. And this is a silly one. This is one of those hat American War of Independence infantry with a head from this set, because you're going to have lots of leftover heads from this box. So I might just go through and plop some of them down on my American War of Independence figures. Let's throw them on the Lazy Susan and see how they scale up. When I was putting these miniatures on these bases, which is how I'm going to base them up, I didn't consider that they're not the same thickness as the scale comparison bases, those 25mm rounds, everything else is on. So it's a subtle difference in height. You can see it there. Maybe a millimeter, probably a little bit less. But the heights are relative anyway, just because of the angle of the camera. Really, we're more paying attention to, again, relative height and proportions. But pay attention too to the fact that some of these miniatures are on those splash or puddle bases, whereas others, including these Firelock miniatures, are not. I've said before in some of my prior reviews that I think they're kind of a fantastic height because they are, in my estimation, like 30mm true scale, which is almost like an optical illusion scale and allows them, I think, to blend in with just about anybody. So what's the final verdict? I think this is a fun little set. I think that they're really, again, beautifully detailed, as we've come to expect from Firelock sets. They went together without much of any trouble at all. And there's a couple of poses here that, like this one, is a good example that we don't see in any of the other Firelock sets that we reviewed so far. So I think if you were asking me, like, what is the one Blood and Plunder set that I should pick up, it would probably be the Sailors, just because of the versatility we've seen in that set. But if you were asking for two, like what are two sets I should pick up, it would probably be the Sailors and this one, simply because I think they complement each other so nicely. There's obviously lots of bits within the Sailors that would work well within this set, as we saw with some of our conversions, and then vice versa. I think that you get some more musket arms in this that would benefit the Sailors box as well. As I also said, you just have to be a little bit more creative in terms of attachment points and how you put the figures together. But if you put in that time investment, I think you'll agree that the end result looks really, really nice. So huge thanks yet again to Firelock for sending these our way to check out. We've got one more plastic box, the last one in their catalog that we've not yet reviewed, which is their Pirates of Legend. So I'm quite looking forward to that. And then we've got a couple of rule books from them that we'll be flipping through as well. Appreciate all of you for dropping by for this one in the meantime. And until next time, happy gaming.